Hey everyone, welcome back. Today's episode, we're going to talk about what is the dark night of the soul. This is going to be a little bit of an elaboration on what we talked in the last episode, the 7 steps to union with God. So if you haven't seen that one, it might be helpful to take a pause on this video, and I will go ahead and link to that video I did last week in the description so that you can watch that one so you don't get too lost on today's, because I will be referring back and forth just a little bit. So something that came to me in prayer over the last week was the difference between St. Teresa of Avila's work and description on prayer, as she's the doctor of the Church of Prayer, and St. John of the Cross's work as the doctor of mysticism, is that St. Teresa more focuses on the stages and descriptions of the development of the stages in prayer, whereas St. John of the Cross's focus is more on the development and changes of more of the essence of what you are, which is a little bit more of an out there topic to discuss. It's less concrete, which I think makes his work a little bit less easy to grasp than Teresa, who is very down to earth, plain language. And so John of the Cross discusses the dark night of the soul. So he's a poet and he has several poems that he's written, but his most famous is probably called The Dark Night of the Soul. And his more extensive writings tend to take his poems and break them down line by line, and he describes what he means and what he's trying to depict in the poem. So the Dark Night of the Soul, he would break up into 2 different sections. The first stage of the Dark Night of the Soul, he would call the Dark Night of the Spirit. The first part he would call the Dark Night of the Senses, and the second part of that he would call the Dark Night of the Spirit. And I would say, to relate back to the video that I did last week, the Dark Night of Sense would most, I think, fit into that transition that I talked about between stage 3 and stage 4, that transition from active prayer to passive or supernatural prayer that Teresa talks about, whereas the Dark Night of the Spirit is related to that 6th stage of intense suffering that we touched on from St. Teresa's video. So the first stage, we're going to go through these one at a time here. The first stage, that Dark Night of Sense, that is the concept of detaching yourself from the material world. And I know personally, because I feel that this is a stage that I've been through, I know I discussed in the last video feeling that it was actually over the COVID lockdowns this past spring that I had that transition stage happen between level 3 prayer and level 4 and some 5 prayer. And I mentioned that, one of the big markers in that transition is the final total relinquishing of your will to God. But another marker of that stage that I definitely know happened in that period of time for me was detachment from the material. So one of the probably biggest temptations to vice that I have experienced in my recent lifetime, and I think is pretty common, is the temptation to materialism, the temptation to focus too much on things and what's the next thing you want, what's the next hot item. People make little collections of things and they obsess about things, and that's definitely something that I've fallen prey to before. And so during the lockdown experience, I kind of took a step back. It was a crazy time, nothing like that had ever happened in any of our lifetimes before, and kind of just thought, if everything went downhill and I lost it all, is that important? And I was kind of at a place in my spiritual journey where, I was starting to read these saints, and they stress so much that, this world is dust. Everything here is transient, and the real treasure is your soul in heaven and that relationship with God. And so, it gave me a lot of time to really process that idea and start to try to apply it in my soul of, if I had to, could I let go of everything and just hang on to God? Because we know as Christians that should be enough. I believe Teresa of Avila has a quotation that's something along the lines of God alone suffices, and that's that whole idea. If we were to lose everything material, we won't have lost our soul, which is the most important. And I'm going to butcher this. I know there's a Bible quote that says, fear not those that can kill the body, but fear those that can wound the soul. It's a paraphrasing, clearly. But yeah, it's that same idea of getting to that place emotionally, spiritually, mentally, that even your favorite things, your very favorite things, if you lost them, you wouldn't be out anything. And that is a hard pill to swallow, and it's a hard head space and heart space to get into. But that's really the dark night of sense that John of the Cross talks about. Letting go of the material world and things that attach us to it so that we can be more open and receptive to the spiritual. And then the dark night of the spirit is a little more out there. It's not something I personally experienced, but I've read some good descriptions. So my current understanding of the dark night of the spirit is, and like I said, that's Teresa of Avila's stage 6, where we talked about there's these periods of great aridity and suffering that are punctuated by these very periodic but profound mystical experiences. It seems to me that what happens in that process is, as you have more of these mystical prayer experiences, you start to develop a more realistic and thorough, comprehensive understanding of who and what God is. And as you are exposed to that, you would say, God's a great light. And you would think that seeing that great light would be glorious, but in reality, when you are first exposed to that light, it's blinding and you can't see the light. All you see is the shadows it casts on you. And it's in the last gospel, another paraphrase. I didn't have this quote prepared, but the light shine in the darkness, and the darkness could not comprehend it. It's that idea that when the pure truth of existence shines upon you, ultimate goodness, ultimate love, ultimate everything good, all you see is the degree to which you fall short and the extraordinary different distance that there is between you and that. And that is part of the source of that suffering, is you start to develop a sense of how you actually are and the state of yourself and the state of your soul. And this is where you see all these saints saying things like, I'm but dust, I'm nothing, I'm a speck of dirt. And it's this realization that when you compare yourself to God, no matter how holy you are, that there is no comparison. And no matter how close you get to God, you are an infinite distance away. You can't close that gap. And so that is part of the desolation that is experienced in the dark night of the spirit, is you see that distance and you are in this emotional and spiritual state of, clearly I recognize that this is the source of all goodness and love, and I want to be in union with that, but I am so far away, there's no way in heck I would ever be able to cross that divide to get to it. And what really pulls these saints who experience this through that experience of desolation are these I think, periodic mystical experiences where God says, no, come. I want you to come to me. I love you and I want you to be near to me. And that gives souls experiencing this that motivation that they need to persevere through this, and that little glimmer of hope that even though they are nothing and they are so dirty and sinful and nowhere near as pure as they would ever need to be in union with God, that God still wants them to come to him. And that sense of love that they feel in those periodic mystical experiences is what ultimately pulls them through and gets them to that stage 7 union with God. Now, one of the things I really feel is important to stress that St. John of the Cross discusses in his work Ascent to Mount Carmel is that through all of this mystical journeying to find God, there's some real danger to be had in this. And so I want to dive into this a little bit because it all sounds all well and good and exciting and, oh yeah, let's do it. But you need to be wary of what you might encounter in this process. So one of the things that St. John of the Cross discusses that is common in souls that advance into these more mystical stages of prayer is that it's normal to have sensory experiences of a mystical or spiritual nature, whether that, through your 5 senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, whether those be visions, locutions where you hear a voice, you smell an aroma, you have a bodily sensation, you taste something. He has pretty severe warnings to be wary of these things. And part of his description of why that is, and this really makes a lot more sense once you've had some degree of mystical experience, is that there's a really wide divide between things that you experience bodily through your senses and things that you experience spiritually. So there's a big difference between the material reality and the spiritual reality, and any attempt to try to discuss or describe or in any way relate spiritual realities in a physical way seems to always fall short. This is actually one of the reasons I'm finding I'm becoming increasingly attracted to Christian art, because as you have these types of experiences, you realize that there really aren't words to describe well enough what you would like to describe and relate to other people. And so some of these other more artistic, poetic forms seem to be able to grasp things a little bit closer than just having a conversation can. But even then, the material can't really do justice to the spiritual experience. And so there's a few dangers with accepting these kinds of sensory mystical experiences. So first, as I've been discussing, is that when you have these sort of sensory experiences, you tend to interpret them how they feel to you. And there can be a lapse in relationship between how you interpret them and the thing that they are actually exhibiting. And then another danger, so St. John of the Cross basically just says, if you ever in prayer in a mystical experience something sensory, just ignore it. Don't pay any attention to it. Don't accept it with your will. And he gives 2 reasons for this. He says, basically these sorts of things come from that next level dimension that I've talked about. And so this can either be from God or from angels, from saints, or this can be of demonic origin, because all of these figures exist in this higher dimension, and so they can all have an impact on you. And so you can't really distinguish definitively what the source is of these experiences. And so John of the Cross describes that if this experience is truly from God, that the spiritual benefits that he intends for you to obtain from that experience basically just burn themselves into your soul whether or not you accept the experience. So it doesn't take an act of your will to benefit from what God is trying to do for you with that. However, for anything sensory, which is the domain of the demonic to act on, that's where they so commonly act, that requires an act of the will to accept. So it can't, if it's a demonic in source and you have, say, a vision, if you reject that with your will, it can't do you harm. In order for it to do you harm, you have to accept it. So St. John of the Cross says, just reject all of them and just in prayer continue to focus solely on God so that you don't run the risk of accepting something from a source that you don't want to be open to. You don't want to open yourself up to. And if it happens to be from God, you will still receive his intended benefit, whether or not you pay any regard to that experience. Another big danger is that if you start accepting these types of experiences, you start to cling to them and you get attached to them, which is completely in opposition to the pursuit of mystical union with God, because the route to union with God is through detachment. And so the risk so often with these sensory experiences is the tendency to attachment. And so then you start to go into prayer seeking these experiences, and that prevents you from seeking God the way you should be, which is through faith, hope, and charity, and not through any sort of material means. Because, like we've said, God is immaterial, and so if you are clinging on to these material experiences that you can categorize with your senses, that makes it more material and less spiritual, it kind of weighs you down and it keeps you from catapulting into the spiritual union that you're seeking. And then it also can be accompanied with a sense of spiritual complacency and vanity. And the only way to attain spiritual union is through ultimate humility. And so if you start to get the sense that, oh, I'm having these cool experiences, it must mean I'm in with God and I'm doing good things and I'm getting really saintly, that's going to hold you back and actually promote qualities that will hinder you from finding mystical union with God. And then John also answers the question, why do we hear of so few souls who reach mystical union? And I've got a quote from him that I found pretty powerful and kind of calls us all out to strive to be better. He says, there are many who desire to advance and persistently beseech God to bring them to this state of perfection. Yet, when God wills to conduct them through the initial trials and mortifications as necessary, they are unwilling to suffer them, and they shun them and flee from the narrow road of life and seek the broad road of their own consolation, which is that of their own perdition. Thus, they do not allow God to begin to grant them their petition. They are like useless containers, for although they desire to reach the state of the perfect, they do not want to be guided down the path of trials that leads to it. They hardly even begin to walk along this road by submitting to what is least, that is, to ordinary sufferings. So one of the things that I've noticed along my personal journey is you have to be in a state to say yes to God, and you have to be listening, because your guardian angel talks to you and wants to lead you down this path and gives you little hints about what you should be doing. So, maybe you think, oh, maybe it would be nice to go to Mass or adoration a day, and then you come up with all these excuses because you don't want to go, because you have other things that would be, more physically, emotionally, temporally satisfying to you. And so you choose to serve your own consolation as opposed to just saying yes. And so that's something big I found, is that to advance down this journey, you have to say yes. So when you open your ears up to listen to that little voice of your guardian angel that says, you should do this, stop coming up with excuses for why you can't do it and just say yes and do it. That's basically what I wanted to cover on the Dark Night of the Soul. I did have a couple questions from a commenter on the last video that I wanted to address briefly before we close up. So the first question, they were asking whether it's possible, so this is from the 7 Stages to Union with God video on the Teresa of Avila steps. They had asked if it was possible to experience stage 4 with others. It seemed that they had had some sort of prayer experience where they felt that they experienced stage 4 with another person or felt their presence in this stage. I'll say, I can only answer for my personal experience. You know, I think God puts us in these stages individually, so it would be possible to experience the same stage at the same time as somebody else, from as far as I can understand, but I've also had an experience in stage 5 of, I was in a prayer group and my husband wasn't with me, but I kind of went into that void space, and it was strange because this time I didn't see any mysteries of the Trinity, but I saw my husband with me. And I don't know if that speaks to the spiritual mystical union that exists in married couples that I don't fully understand, but I definitely walked away from that experience saying, this is real. When you get married, there's some sort of link spiritually that happens between you and your spouse, such that even when he wasn't there praying with me, somehow he was still praying with me. And I know I've heard a priest say, oh, you should be, if you want to step it up, you should pray 3 rosaries a day. And someone asked, oh, well, what if my husband prays one of them? And he was like, you know, there's something about marriage. I think that counts. And so that speaks to more of maybe that tie between spouses. But that's what I know about that one. Well, additionally, they said that they had felt maybe the emotional state of another or prayerful words of another that they didn't feel were their own. I can speak to, because they had also brought up the concept of the communion of saints with that question. And I can speak to, I've had, so like for example, I'm preparing for this video and I'm gonna do a follow-up video and a little bit more with John of the Cross just to break it up and make these less lengthy. I was in Mass and after communion, I distinctly felt, I sensed the presence of John of the Cross with me, and I don't know how to explain it other than I sensed kind of the essence of his persona. So he was a little quiet monk, kind of poetic, artistic, and I just sensed this type of energy near me, and like deep in my soul, I had an understanding of read my poems again. And it was funny because I have this little book of poetry from John of the Cross that I love, and I had read through it multiple times, and it had always been maybe just out of grasp, and I actually went home that day and read it all the way through again, and it was the first time that I felt like I really understood it. So that was kind of a cool experience, and maybe that helps address the question a little bit, because I do think that that is a way in which the communion of saints can communicate with us, is I would describe it as more like telepathic in nature, where I haven't, you know, audibly heard anything, but it's more, I get just this sense of someone's presence, and depending on who it is, it feels different to the point that I can, and I can't tell you how, but I can identify who it is. And then if they are trying to communicate with me, I just obtain an understanding of what they're expressing. And it's not something that I can quote verbatim. It's just an understanding in my soul. So that's the best way I can describe that. And then the second question was, how does stage 5 compare with other religious experiences? Which is actually a thought that I had that would be interesting for a future video. But I have not done enough research into other religious experiences to answer that yet. But I do have that on my list for a potential video to make, so look forward to that. If you're enjoying my content, like, subscribe, share, hit the thumbs up. If you want to help me get to the 200 follower benchmark, please share this with a couple friends. That would really help me out. And look forward to my next video, which I will be doing. I'm gonna explain a diagram that St. John of the Cross made where he drew the path to union with God, which is really interesting. So I'm gonna walk everyone through that. So have a great rest of your day. Have a happy new year, everyone.